Awesome. Welcome to PodRocket. I'm Kate, the producer of PodRocket. With me today is Nolman Chow, one of LogRocket's engineers, and also Evan Yu. Evan, welcome.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us today. I have to say, having you come on the show has been the biggest request that PodRocket has had. So we are super excited to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us.
Cool. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Noel, do you want to get started?
I think just kind of to start with, I feel like most listeners will probably, be familiar with Vue and kind of know what it is. I guess if you could give us kind of a quick intro on maybe yourself and who you are, that'd be awesome. And then we'll kind of jump into, I have a whole bunch of topics I want to cover, but jump into all kinds of stuff from there.
So the whole thing starts, I think the first commit on Vue, well, originally it wasn't even called Vue. It was called Seed.js. That was just a random name that I picked. I was working at Google back then in New York, and we were doing a lot of quick prototypes, iterations, a lot of these explorative UI prototypes. So we needed something to move fast, and I just wanted to build something that allows me to feel comfortable, cranking out stuff fast. So that was the reason I started looking at Angular, which was used in some of the projects we did. And I felt there are, the Angular already has this template syntax, and you have this reactive binding between the template and your state. But there are also a lot of other concepts which I just felt I didn't really need. So the initial attempt was really just to replicate a reactive templating system, but without all the burden that I didn't want. Also, I wanted to play with the idea of using ES5 getters and setters for a reactivity system. And back then, because people still wanted to support IE8, so a lot of people were like, no ES5. And I was like, whatever. We only support Chrome internally anyway. So, so that was the first iteration of Vue, pretty much. But it was really just a side project. I was just building it in my spare time. It's more like a technical toy in the beginning. So I worked on it occasionally, but never really thought about, hey, I want to push this thing to be public or anything. But eventually, I guess I started using it in some of the personal projects, and I felt it actually feels pretty good. So I decided to eventually write the documentation and design a logo, switch the new name, found the name Vue was available on NPM, so that was really good. I think all the 3-letter names are taken now, but it was still available back then. Then I think I published the first version in February 2014, and that was the beginning. But still, that was just a personal project, really.
Yeah, cool. And then I think you moved to Meteor after that and spent some time there. And then while you were there, you kind of made the jump to start working on Vue full time. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. Were you kind of nervous at the time? I guess, was there a definitive point where you went was there an event that occurred that made you think I should probably make this switch? Or was it kind of like a slower, you just kind of had this creeping feeling that Vue might be where your future was?
I guess it's a slow process. I think the biggest driving factor was burnout at my day job. I guess the burnout is also partially caused by the pressure of having to work on an open source project with growing demand in your spare time. So, I was essentially working every hour I was awake. I was either doing my day job or answering issues or fixing bugs in Vue. So I didn't really give myself too much time to relax. I think that was around 2016. Yeah. Late 2015, early 2016. So that period of time, I was really burned out. And I was struggling to just feel like I wasn't really feeling fulfilled at my day job, and I feel like I'm more alive when I'm working on Vue. So that's the biggest reason, because for me, I knew that if I quit into to do any open source full time, I'm probably gonna make a lot less money, at least initially, and it's not as stable. It's always kind of a leap of faith. But for me, being able to just work on it because it's the thing I really want to do, it's a big utility plus. So I was willing to take a pay cut to do it. And the worst case scenario is if, after a year, I'm like, no, this is not working. I mean, I can always try to find another job. The option is always there. So yeah, I decided to do it in early 2016, and luckily it all worked out. So I never looked back.
Yeah, nice. I feel like it's such like a story that so many devs like love, that whole kind of like, oh, I quit my day job, then went to open source, and now it funds me, and like I think that's why people like hearing you kind of tell it so much. Cool. I guess did you consider kind of any other like funding sources or anything when you were making that decision? Were you like eyeing other projects at the time and seeing what was happening out there in terms of open source funding?
Yeah. Interestingly, so Rich Harris just got hired by Vercel, right? So I recall when I was right before I was about to quit, I was actually sending out resumes, and basically I was sending out a few job applications on those like open hiring platforms like Level or something like that. Then basically my description was, if you want to hire me, you need to basically, your company must use Vue in your product, and I need to spend this amount of time on Vue. So that was a condition in my job application. Nobody picked it up. So I was like, I probably can't use that word here, but I was like, fuck it. I'm going to do this. And yeah, so I did try, right? So, but it was difficult, right? Especially when your project is, I think Vue back then was probably in this limbo of, it has quite some traction. It's a lot of work. It really demands my full-time attention, but it wasn't as big as today, where it's enough to, generate enough ecosystem and all this sort of support from the community to make it possible. So I kind of had to rely on some sort of, basically I was just ready to fall back on my savings in the beginning.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah, it must have been kind of scary for sure. I mean, did you ever, like kind of in the early days, did you ever consider like not having it be an open source project, or did you know that it was like, this is going to be an open source front end framework, and that was kind of just how it was?
Yeah, it has to be open source. That's the whole reason I'm doing it.
Yeah.
I just feel, it just feel, because Vue started as open source project, and it only got traction because it's an open source project. I don't think, interestingly, because front end landscape is quite interesting. If you think about the current generation of frameworks, one is from Google, one is from Facebook. Vue and Svelte are independent, but prior to that, there were actually successful paying models in front end like Sencha. So they were actually making a lot of money, but their target, it really is these wholesale component suites to enterprise. If you're working in the framework layer, it's actually really difficult to monetize, because there are these big players like Google and Facebook who don't really expect to make money from this. For them, it's more like React is strategically more like a hiring weapon. It creates this whole ecosystem, developers who are familiar with React, which makes it really easy for Facebook to hire people. But for Vue, the only reason that I'm working on it is because it has created a very vibrant user community. People like it, and that's why I work on it.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, very cool. Yeah, there's definitely kind of that network effect, I think, in front end frameworks. Like, were you, I guess, kind of acknowledging that, did that even add more hesitation when you were starting with Vue? Like, there's no way we can overcome these big players. Like, how did you get over that fear?
It's a constant uphill battle. I mean, even today, like where I wouldn't say Vue has, people still consider Vue the underdog when compared to React, right? It's much bigger in the early days, and it's funny enough, like ever since day one I released Vue, there's always been this kind of some users from like, oh, it's from an indie developer, it's going to disappear next year. Every year I see a comment like that. It's funny, right? And it keeps going on. I'm kind of happy to prove those people wrong, though. It's always cool to be able to just. I think it. I kind of wanted to talk a bit about this on Twitter, but it feels weird because a lot of people seem to think React has won, quote won. They believe, oh, it's the React world. Everybody just learns React. Everybody uses React. But in reality, there are a huge group of developers outside the React world who don't use it. A lot of people still, like, especially in PHP or WordPress world, a lot of people are still on jQuery. For them, even Vue is kind of like the new stuff. And Vue itself has over 1.5 million weekly active users. And if you look at the DevTools extension number, Vue actually it definitely isn't small compared to React. They're on the same order of magnitude in terms of user count. So a lot of times, Twitter really is kind of an echo chamber where I sometimes kind of feel like, oh, why is everything in React? Because I follow a lot of people in the React ecosystem as well. But, in reality, when you look at the numbers, you realize, okay, like there are so many people, so many web developers in the world. It's extremely diverse. Like, even if you look at all the web component libraries, sometimes the numbers may surprise you.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's so many out there, and yeah, like so many players in the space. I guess, kind of going back to the early days again, when you were working on Vue, maybe like when you first had the dev tools installed, were there any sites that you came across, like big players that you were surprised, like, oh, they're using Vue? Like, that's pretty cool. Were there any moments you had like that?
Yeah, I guess Louis Vuitton is actually using Vue.
Yeah.
Nice, yeah. And there are a lot of recent movie trailer sites are using Nuxt. Like the Matrix 4 trailer site, the Dune trailer site, they're both using Nuxt. I just recently moved to Singapore. I was like buying furniture online and found out a few local Singapore furniture shops are using Vue. It's always nice when I'm actually just randomly stumbled upon the site. I'm like, oh wait, my DevTools icon light up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I have that experience all the time as well. I think I feel it more when I see, like, I'm on a big player's site and I just wouldn't expect them to be using Vue. I'd expect, like a React shop or something, but it's always cool. I should have came up with a list before I got on here, but I feel like that happens like at least a few times a week. I'm always like, cool, look, Vue, it's happening. Yeah, cool. I guess kind of on that, while we're in this mode of like comparing frameworks a little bit, I feel like a lot of people think about like Angular, kind of when Vue was starting, how Angular was in its kind of transitionary period, and that led to a lot of Vue success. Do you think that that's true?
I honestly don't know. I think Angular still kind of largely appeals to its own dedicated group of developers coming from a more Java, C# enterprisey background. Because the thing is about Angular is, if you're a Java developer, it feels very, very you will feel very at home in Angular. Both 1 and 2. A lot of concepts kind of carry through, right? But if you are like me, I'm self-taught in terms of web development, or you're kind of coming from a designer background, or you're just starting from basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, Angular will feel very intimidating. So I think Vue's initial success, or Vue's long-term success, has always been based on this sort of, we assume our users, first we acknowledge the fact that web development has a very low barrier of entry, right? You can literally just open an HTML file and you can write a web page without any prior knowledge, right? So we kind of want to use that as the baseline. Like, how can we have someone with just the basic HTML and JavaScript knowledge and be able to build something interactive? And that's always been the premise of Vue. So to this day, we still we guarantee that like every build of Vue will always be usable without build step. You can pull it directly from a CDN with no npm whatsoever. And you can write it directly in an HTML file. The whole application can be in a single HTML file. That's the and it can be used in production. I mean, people kind of use the argument all the time. They go, you can use the whole JSX transform in the browser too, but you wouldn't do that in production. But you can shift something like with Vue to production, and a lot of people actually do that. People use it as a jQuery replacement in some cases. All right, so that's kind of an important factor. I think this really kind of helped people from the backend developers, from like the PHP developers, Laravel developers. They loved Vue a lot. So I think a big adoption wave came from the Laravel community when Taylor Otwell, author of Laravel, started using Vue himself, and it kind of resonated with them because it just felt easier to pick up for backend developers. And I think that's sometimes, senior developers like to talk about how like simple is not easy, and they kind of imply that something being easy means it doesn't scale or it's inferior in some other aspects. But I think, in practice, easiness is underrated because in the end, in the world, not all software like software are meant to solve problems, and having an easy tool to have it solve that problem in itself has value. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to always craft the most delicate and sophisticated software in order to solve a problem. If you have a hammer that can solve a problem, use that hammer, right? So in that sense, Vue is always trying to be the pragmatic solution instead of being the one where you can say, "Oh, look how advanced I am! Look how like what crazy patent I just invented with this framework."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think a lot of people kind of get in that headspace, like CRUD apps are solved, and like the front ends that aren't complicated, they all work well and everything's fine. But I feel like, I don't know, if I'm just reflecting on even like the UIs I've used in the past day, like there's been several where there's like some crippling front end bug happening, and it's like, there's just like the tooling isn't there to help these people build sites easily. At least they're not finding it. So I totally agree. Yeah, cool. Let's see. I think like I kind of wanted to start talking about newer stuff here. Again, I feel most listeners are probably familiar with like Vue at least, and it's like comparing Vue and React isn't that interesting, except for in a couple narrow cases. But can we kind of talk a little bit about like the shift to V3 and what you think are some of the cool new features that like people who are familiar but haven't used Vue in a while, they might want to come back and check out?
So Vue 3 at the fundamental level, there's just a lot of fundamental improvements, like it's smaller because it's now tree shakeable. A lot of parts are tree shakeable. It's faster. I mean, if you do a rewrite and it's not faster, it probably failed. So luckily, we have pretty significant performance improvements compared to Vue 2. It has better TypeScript support, significantly improved. And in fact, in the past year, we spent a lot of the efforts in the surrounding supporting tools of the framework. Like we have a new DevTools extension that supports both Vue 2 and Vue 3. And it's also extensible. So you can actually write your own. If you have a library, you want to lock some events into the Vue DevTools, you can actually do that. And then we have a new VS Code IDE extension, which has significantly better. Overall, the tooling support is just significantly improved. Now, even inside the template, you get TSX-like type inference and type checking and everything. So it feels like TypeScript is part of your Vue single file component. And then server-side rendering also greatly improved performance. And probably the most significant part about user-facing API is obviously the composition API, which is inspired by React hooks. A lot of people say, oh, it's just React hooks. Well, I kind of have to explain every time, no, it's not. The two kind of works. So like when you extract a reusable function, the pattern looks very similar, but fundamentally how they work is very different. So Vue is kind of like one shot. You set up all these objects once, and then you just reference them. It kind of represents two ways of thinking about reactivity in front end. React is like, let's go immutable. We're gonna pull the world every time we render. Whereas Vue is let's go truly reactive. We have these reactive objects that you're gonna hold a reference to, and you watch them. If they change, something happens. It's quite interesting, but I won't go too much into that. But for Vue itself, composition API unlocks a lot of interesting capabilities, like what people were excited about with hooks. Composition API can do a lot of that too. You can extract your custom utilities, use this, use that. But at the same time, it also has better TypeScript support. And more importantly, it's a similar argument for how hooks improve the code organization compared to class-based components, in the sense that you're no longer bound to a this context. You're now able to move around and organize your code just like normal functions. So that it's an interesting trade-off, because like we've gone through a lot of debate on the introduction of the composition API, and the consensus now inside the team is that it essentially, because it's more free form, it allows beginners to write slightly worse code, but it allows experienced developers to write significantly better code. So that's the trade-off we're kind of taking. So you can think of the options API versus the composition API. The design trade-off is options API is like, even if you give it to beginners, they can write somewhat okay code. But when they write very complex components, it's going to be a mess. With composition API, and the problem with options API is, even in the hands of experienced developers, they sometimes will struggle to make things maintainable. But with composition API, it's sort of like, if you're experienced, you can organize it just like how you write normal JavaScript, because we as developers, we know how to organize functions, extract functions, type them, organize them, test them, right? So composition API makes that all the same with normal JavaScript code. So you can apply all your code skills on them. But on the other hand, if you don't know how to write good code in the first place, you might still write a mess, right? So it's kind of unavoidable. So which is why we still don't really tell people to say, oh, you should definitely go with options API, or you should definitely go with composition API. So we're currently working on the new docs where we try to explicitly discuss what I just talked about, like how, in what situation you might want to consider this, in what situation you might want to consider that, because a lot of times really it's not a one size for all kind of situation. So I guess the best way for us to solve that is to explain that with documentation, to help people understand when they should use what fits them specifically better, because different experience level kind of it'll probably suit one API will suit you better based on your experience level.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, again, like I'm kind of a hobbyist Vue dev, like that's what I like to do my side projects and stuff, and so I'm in that space a lot where I'm like, Googling stuff and trying to read the docs. I have found recently that like with the like the composition and the options API both out there now, I've found it a little bit harder to like search for and find an answer to a specific problem, because both exists and there's like conversations happening around both. Did you kind of anticipate that increase in complexity around the discussion of how Vue works?
That definitely is a problem. I think it's interesting because we, for the past year, it's pretty much a transition period where, because both APIs exist, and I wish we did we push out the new docs earlier, but I just spent way too much time on Vite.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah,
I'm excited to talk about
yeah,
Vite too. Yeah.
yeah. But I think definitely the new documentation probably should have been out there earlier to give people a clear picture of like what to give people the guidance. Right now the confusion mainly comes from when you're searching for something. The docs itself is still like the main paragraphs are in options API, and then composition API is like kind of tucked away in a separate section, kind of like how the React docs has been, right? It's like still class API, and then hooks is in a separate section. But I think the React world has pretty much consolidated on hooks, whereas in the Vue world, we're probably going to see them coexist for a bit longer, which is one of the reasons why we work on syntax sugar like script setup to help make composition API more ergonomic to use, because the little bit more verbosity when you're using it is what turned a lot of people away. But we believe with more compile time, we're actually investing more in the compiler front, because we can see how compile time optimizations and syntax transforms can unlock both performance and development experience gains. So script setup is inspired by Svelte, right? So we essentially took some of the good parts from hooks and also some good parts from Svelte, and now you have a very concise, succinct syntax for using composition API within single file Vue components. At the same time, the benefit of this is Vue's reactivity system. The composition API works both in and out of components. It's the same API. So you can move any code inside a big component out of your component and refactor it or extract it into reusable functions. You can do that very easily. So it's not bound to a component-based compilation model. So I think we hit a pretty good sweet spot in this, in terms of having decent in-component ergonomics versus still being able to allow refactoring, extraction, and cross-component logic reuse. And that's so this will essentially be the focus of the new documentation. We want to highlight, because we arrived at this after a long time. A lot of these RFCs went through some really long discussions. So the new docs is essentially trying to consolidate all of this. Like, this is the new recommendation if you want to use composition API. It'll give you I would say it's quite different from what Vue 2 looks like, but I believe a lot of developers will feel actually right at home, because the fundamental concepts in Vue is still the same. It's the same reactivity model. It's the same template syntax. All the component built-in directives and features are the same. So it's really just a more flexible way of expressing your stateful logic.
Yep, totally. Yeah, I feel like every time I've delved in, I'm always like, oh yeah, I feel like I'm just kind of writing more functional JavaScript code, and it's really nice when I'm putting those together. So I agree. Evan, when you guys were writing up kind of the composition API, and again, it's loosely modeled on React hooks. Do you worry about devs when they're coming over who are super familiar with hooks, like conflating those two ideas and like how they work under the hood?
I don't think that's a big concern, because so funny enough, you need to really understand how hooks work to be able to use it. So when people come over, I think the common confusion I've seen is people assume that simple variable destructures would stay reactive. Whereas in Vue, you kind of have to switch your mindset back to when people use React hooks for a long time, your mind gets reconfigured by React, and you start to think everything in hooks mental model. But when you use Vue, you kind of have to switch back to normal JavaScript heuristics. So basically, if you destructure properties of an object, it loses the connection to the original object, right? That's how JavaScript usually works. And it's the same way in Vue. That's probably the only thing that trips people up if they're coming from hooks. But they would adjust really quickly because they're basically just trying to say, oh, I'm no longer using React hooks. This is just like normal JavaScript. If I want things to stay reactive, just keep accessing it from the original object.
Yeah, gotcha. Totally. Cool. Yeah, again, I just like, they function differently, so I wonder if other devs would have those kinds of issues. But gotcha. I guess the only other kind of big Vue 3 migration question I have is, are there have the libraries been slower to migrate than you anticipated? I'm thinking Bootstrap Vue, Vuetify, Vue Material. Yeah.
It's somewhat anticipated. I mean, I anticipated the migration to be slow because when we started the redesign, I knew that for better internal implementations, for better performance and memory usage, we had to completely rewrite the virtual DOM implementation. And as a result of that, some of the internals of say how a vnode is represented and how they are created was reworked. And because of the structure changes of the vnodes, which was technically a private API, people should not rely on it. But unfortunately, a lot of the libraries, especially the ones that has complex UI components, sometimes they reach for those things. And Vuetify 1 relied a lot on these. I know Chakra UI View also did this. So we evaluated this when working on the migration build, and I was able to get some of the basic components that's not using the private APIs to work. But unfortunately, getting all these existing libraries to be 100% compatible is just way too costly. So the migration build eventually only focus on the public APIs. So if your library only uses the public APIs, there's a very good chance that it'll just work. For example, the migration build was able to work with the Vue 2 version of the Vue router and Vuex without much modification. And then you can, so in our migration example, there is a step-by-step commits. We moved the Hacker News Vue 2 example to Vue 3. It's so also moved from Webpack to Vite in the process, and then we swapped Vue 2 with Vue 3 migration build, then we swapped away the Vue router, then we swapped away Vuex. So that all worked. But in practice, when you have a large library with a long history, there's just always be this technical debt where people reach for your private APIs and rely on specific behavior, which are particularly difficult to retain when you're doing a big refactor or rewrite.
Gotcha. Yeah, cool. I guess the only other, I think we'll have some more time for listener questions here, but one of those was how long until Vue 3 is no longer Vue Next and it's the main version?
Well, I originally hoped I could do that before I move, but I wasn't able to. And now after the move, it's been a battle going back into work because of all the post-move, cross-continent move logistics. And then the kids can't really go to school until January. So it's been a bit tough getting stable work hours in. But we're really hoping to do that as soon as we can. And that is the only blocker left really is the documentation. The new documentation is currently being worked on. It's completely redesigned with almost all the chapters receiving major revisions to reflect composition API usage, latest best practices. We also sort of updated some of the framework level concepts and descriptions because Vue has evolved from just a library into more like a proper framework. So a lot of this work going into the new documentation, and hopefully I don't want to rush it because I really want to we take documentation really, really seriously. So we really want to, show the best form of it. So at this stage, I think it's probably realistic to aim for Christmas.
With that, let's talk about Vite a little bit.
Yeah.
Maybe just for listeners, I feel like it's probably not quite as pervasive. Can you explain what Vite is?
Yeah, so Vite is a new build tool that I worked on since early last year. So it's not really that new. It's been out for over how long has it been out? It's quite a long time now. Crazy to think about. But anyway, if you use Webpack, Vite is think of Vite as a combination of Webpack plus Webpack CLI plus Webpack dev server plus a bunch of config loaders that you have to write yourself, but they are all sort of works out of the box, and it's lighter, it's faster. In some cases, the speed difference can be quite astonishing. You kind of have to try it yourself. If you're a React dev and you still use create React apps, try run npm init vite now, and just test the speed difference yourself. I think that's the best explanation. But internally, the key feature of Vite is that its dev server is unbundled. So your source modules are served over native ESM by the browser, and we do compilation transforms on the fly. And over ESM, we are able to implement extremely fast hot module replacement. And more importantly, the hot module replacement performance is decoupled from the total size of modules. So this is what makes it fundamentally better in large projects. When you have a project with 1,000 components, right? And with Webpack, you probably experience like you save something, you wait a few seconds for it to change. And even with hot module replacement, it's still like 2 to 3 seconds, right? But with Vite, it's always going to be 100 milliseconds, regardless how many components you have. So that significantly increases the feedback loop, just like accelerates your feedback loop, so you can stay in the zone. You can constantly make tweaks without having to like wait for it to update. Like personally for me, after I successfully implemented the hot module replacement, I just could never go back to Webpack anymore. And another part of it is we use ESBuild, which is a Go-based JavaScript transpiler / bundler. It's a very awesome project by Evan Wallace. He's the CTO of Figma. And we use ESBuild inside Vite as the pre-bundler, which pre-bundles your dependencies. We use it to transpile TypeScript and TSX and JSX. We use it to do CSS and JavaScript minification. So Vite is sort of this hybrid tool where we leverage these native parts whenever possible. Like in the dev server, we leverage browser's native ESM. On the build tooling side, we try to leverage ESBuild whenever possible because it's just so fast. But we also recognize that for JS developers, it's important to have a plugin system that you can understand and easily write plugins for, which is why Vite is also compatible with Rollup. So we use Rollup for production build under the hood, but during development, even though we're not using Rollup for development, we do allow Rollup compatible plugins that'll work both in development and production. So we simulate a Rollup plugin pipeline during development so that your plugins can work. It's actually, you can directly use a lot of Rollup plugins in Vite, and it'll work in development too. So this is why the current maintainer of Rollup actually recommends Vite as the dev server for Rollup. So if you're still using plain Rollup, you should really switch to Vite. You're still using Rollup under the hood, but you get a better dev server experience.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I guess personally I can speak to that as well. Like I remember spinning up my first Vite project and being like just blown away, like so fast. Making large scale changes and like changing dependencies and stuff was just like staggeringly quick. I guess, yeah, like Is there any other motivation for people using Webpack, especially Webpack like without Babel? Because I feel like that's what's really slowing down a lot of those builds. Like, is there anything in particular you'd recommend? Like, I guess you'd say to them to persuade them to come give Vite a shot.
I mean, if they are happy with Webpack, like I don't. The funny thing is, a lot of people ask me that question, and my stance is that you should try it regardless. Because it's likely faster, like even if you're not using Babel. But whether it's worth it is up to you, because the reason I built Vite is not to convince people to switch from Webpack. That is not my goal, right? And there are actually also cases where Webpack is sort of Webpack has features that Vite doesn't do, and it's totally fine. The key idea is Vite is designed to be a happy path for maybe 80 to 90% of average web developers who don't really want to hand tune every single config that the build tool has to offer. They're like, I just want a build tool that works, allow me to ship stuff. And Vite is, again, I always try to do pragmatic tools. If you have a 90% common case, that can be solved in a simpler and faster way, there should be something for that. It doesn't necessarily mean this tool should replace the tool that was there before it. Maybe now they just each fit a better niche, each fit a better use case. There's probably still overlap, and if it overlaps, you probably want to use the faster tool. But again, it's not the goal to say to replace a competitor. The goal is to make more developers being able to build things faster.
Gotcha. Totally. Yeah. I guess while we're on the topic of replacement, do you think Vite will ever like replace or consume Nuxt's Webpack like default?
I hope so. So Nuxt 3 has been made compatible with Vite, both Vite and Webpack. I think the smart move from the Nuxt team is making Nuxt core essentially build tool agnostic in some way. I think they did this mostly because they designed Nuxt 3 in the beginning to also be end deployment environment agnostic, in the sense that it can be deployed not just as a Node.js, long-running Node.js process, but also for serverless functions, Cloudflare workers, and all those environments. They had those in mind when they first designed the thing. So it also makes sense to sort of decouple itself from the build tool if possible. Although I don't really know, I haven't really looked into the trade-offs that they made in this, because I think by making a meta framework build tool agnostic, there's probably some trade-offs in it. I'm not fully aware of that because I haven't really read the code, but there are a lot of interesting solutions that's specifically Vite based. Like SvelteKit is Vite based, Astro is now Vite based. Shopify's new framework, React framework Hydrogen, is Vite based. It also supports React Server components. There's also some framework agnostic Vite SSR solutions like Vite plugin SSR, and which is you can render Vue or React or other frameworks using that, but it's kind of like a meta framework for frameworks, framework for meta framework, sort of. Yeah. So it's I think this whole space, the Vite dev tool space is super interesting, because I created it only for Vue, but after I realized it could be just framework agnostic, it actually now have this very, very cool ecosystem of cross-component collaboration, cross-framework collaboration, like Solid.js, Marco team, Svelte team, and Astro and Vue, of course. Like our build tooling is now all aligned with Vite, and so anything that we commonly share between the frameworks, we can sort of drop it down into Vite and make it benefit more people.
Okay, so we do have some listener questions. We got quite a few listener questions. We don't have time for all of them. But here's one that I think is interesting. You touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but what motivates you to do what others don't, and how do you deal with burnouts?
I guess the motivation is really knowing that my work makes people's life easier. Um, I mean, I also make money from it, which is good. But that's kind of like when I started doing it. The motivation is primarily because because people use my software, and when I see people use my software and they're like, "Wow, this makes my life so much easier. Thank you." These are the really like the main reason for me to keep doing open source. And this another important part of it is because we started to have when Vue got a little bigger, we had started to have these offline conferences, and when I meet people offline, this feeling kind of realizes much more intensively. Like when people come in front of you, shake your hand, and like, thank you so much for making Vue. That feeling is really like something you don't get by doing a 9 to 5 office work. I never experienced that when I was just being an employer, but when you create something that that you sort of you put it out into the world and people start appreciating it, it's really amazing. So for me, that's the main motivation, really.
Awesome. And another one, if you had to start over, what would be the biggest rework you would do?
Rework. I would probably design the whole migration, Vue 2 to Vue 3 migration, a bit better. I think we tried our best, but looking back, you can always do better. With all the things hindsight that you now have, we could have probably avoided some of the small breakages that caused too much. Like there are some small breakages, but kind of makes the whole upgrading process more difficult than it should be. So if we had time to go back, I would probably tweak it a bit more so that they have smaller impact in the whole migration process.
Sure. Well, Evan, thank you so much. This has been awesome. Thank you so much for coming on PodRocket. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And
yeah,
great questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Super nice to meet you. Good chatting. Thank you.